The wind howled through the wooden buildings of Cedar Ridge like a wild animal searching for prey. It was February 1878, and the frontier settlement in Colorado Territory was fighting for its life against the worst winter anyone could remember. Snow piled higher than wagon wheels, and the temperature hadn't climbed above freezing in 3 weeks. Inside the general store, folks gathered around the potbelly stove, their faces drawn with worry. The supplies were running dangerously low. Flour barrels that should have lasted until spring were nearly empty. Salt pork was getting scarce, and the coffee beans were already gone. People spoke in hushed voices about rationing what little they had left. 20-3-year-old Mary Elizabeth had always been the kind of woman who spoke her mind, even when others wished she wouldn't. While other young ladies in town spent their time sewing and gossiping about potential husbands, Mary Elizabeth preferred reading books and asking questions that made the preacher uncomfortable during Sunday services. She had turned down 3 marriage proposals in the past 2 years, much to her aunt's horror. The last one came from Thomas Bennett, the banker's son, who owned half the businesses in town. When she politely refused him, saying she wasn't ready to settle down, the whole community started whispering. Some said she was too proud for her own good. Others wondered what was wrong with her that she couldn't see a good opportunity when it stared her in the face. But Mary Elizabeth didn't care much about what people thought. She had bigger concerns on her mind, especially when she saw how the harsh winter was affecting everyone. The elderly Mrs. Patterson had developed a terrible cough that wouldn't go away. Little Jimmy Crawford looked thinner each day because his family was stretching their food to make it last. And then there were the visitors who sometimes appeared at the settlement's gates on that particular Tuesday morning. When the snow was falling so thick you could barely see across the street, Mary Elizabeth heard a commotion near the main gate. She wrapped her wool shawl tight around her shoulders and stepped outside to see what was happening. There, at the entrance to Cedar Ridge, stood a Cheyenne woman holding a small child. Both of them looked half frozen, their dark eyes filled with desperate hope. The woman was young, maybe Mary Elizabeth's age, with long black hair that hung loose around her thin face. The child, probably no more than 4 years old, clung to his mother's torn deerskin dress. Most of the townspeople had gathered in a half-circle, keeping their distance. They stared at the visitors with a mixture of fear and suspicion. These were dangerous times, and tensions between the settlers and the local tribes had been growing worse each month. There had been attacks on both sides, and trust was as scarce as food. Mayor Hutchinson, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and permanent scowl, stepped forward. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip as he addressed the woman in broken phrases, trying to tell her to move along. The Cheyenne woman didn't understand English, but she could see the rejection in his face. She held up her child, pointing to his hollow cheeks and chattering teeth, hoping these people would understand the universal language of a mother's desperation. Mary Elizabeth watched from the crowd, her heart breaking as she saw the little boy's condition. His lips were blue from cold, and his tiny body shook uncontrollably. Without thinking about consequences, she pushed through the group of onlookers and approached the pair. "They're starving," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Look at them. When did we become the kind of people who turn away a hungry child?" Mayor Hutchinson's face darkened. "Now you listen here, Mary Elizabeth. We barely have enough food for our own families. We can't be feeding every person who shows up at our door, especially not them Indians. They got their own people to take care of them." "Their own people are probably starving too," Mary Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "This winter has been hard on everyone." She looked at the young mother, who seemed to understand that someone was trying to help. Mary Elizabeth smiled and gestured for the woman to wait. Then she hurried back to her small cabin, where she kept her personal supply of flour and dried meat. When she returned with a cloth bag filled with food, the crowd had grown larger. People whispered among themselves, some nodding in approval of her kindness, others shaking their heads in disapproval. Mary Elizabeth handed the supplies to the grateful mother, who clutched them to her chest and spoke rapid words in Cheyenne. Tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The little boy looked up at Mary Elizabeth with wide, dark eyes, and managed a small smile before his mother quickly led him away into the swirling snow. They disappeared into the white wilderness, leaving behind the community divided in opinion about what had just happened. Over the next few days, word spread quickly through Cedar Ridge about Mary Elizabeth's act of charity. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, her decision to share precious food with outsiders became the main topic of conversation wherever people gathered. Some folks admired her compassion. Old Henrik, who ran the blacksmith shop, said it reminded him of his grandmother back in Sweden, who never turned away a hungry person. The schoolteacher, Miss Carolyn, quietly mentioned that Christian charity should extend to all people, regardless of their background, but many others saw Mary Elizabeth's actions as dangerous and foolish. They argued that she had put the entire community at risk by encouraging Indians to come to their settlement. What if word spread among the tribes that Cedar Ridge was an easy place to get free food? What if the woman and child were scouts, gathering information for a potential attack? The criticism grew louder when another blizzard hit the following week, making it impossible for supply wagons to reach the settlement. The remaining food supplies dwindled even faster, and people began looking for someone to blame for their worsening situation. Mayor Hutchinson called a town meeting for the following Sunday after church services. The small wooden building was packed with worried residents, their faces gaunt from hunger and stress. Children sat quietly beside their parents, sensing the tension in the air even if they didn't understand the adult conversations. "Folks," the mayor began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "we're facing the hardest winter this settlement has ever seen. Our food supplies are running low, and it looks like this weather isn't going to break anytime soon. We need to make some difficult decisions about how we're going to survive until spring." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Now, I've been thinking about what happened last week with Mary Elizabeth giving away our precious food to strangers. Some of you might think that was a kind thing to do, but I see it differently. In times like these, charity begins at home. We got our own children to feed, our own elderly to care for." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mary Elizabeth sat in the back row, her spine straight and her chin raised, refusing to show any sign of backing down from her decision. "Furthermore," Mayor Hutchinson continued, his voice growing stronger, "Mary Elizabeth has shown a pattern of behavior that concerns me greatly. She refuses to marry good men who could provide for her and contribute to our community's stability. She questions our preachers' wisdom during services. And now she's putting all of us in danger by encouraging hostile Indians to come to our gates." The murmurs grew louder, and Mary Elizabeth could feel dozens of eyes turning toward her. Some faces showed sympathy, but many more reflected the growing anger and fear that had been building in the community for weeks. That night, as Mary Elizabeth lay in her small bed listening to the wind rattle her cabin walls, she knew that something had changed forever in Cedar Ridge. The warmth and acceptance she had once felt from her neighbors was disappearing like smoke in the winter air. She could sense that difficult days lay ahead, but she had no idea just how dramatically her life was about to change. The heavy wooden gates of Cedar Ridge slammed shut with a sound that echoed across the frozen landscape like a death sentence. Mary Elizabeth stood in the swirling snow, watching the place she had called home for 5 years disappear behind walls of timber and fear. The verdict had been swift and brutal. The town council, led by Mayor Hutchinson, had declared her a danger to the community's survival. They had taken everything from her except the clothes on her back. Her warm winter coat, her sturdy boots, her small savings, even the family Bible that belonged to her grandmother, all of it remained locked away inside the settlement. She wore only a thin wool dress, a light shawl, and worn leather shoes that were already letting in the cold. The temperature was dropping fast as afternoon faded into evening. Mary Elizabeth had never felt cold like this before. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was the kind of cold that seemed to reach inside your bones and squeeze the life out of you. She wrapped her arms around herself and started walking. Though she wasn't sure which direction to go, the nearest settlement was Fort Morgan, over 100 miles to the east. She had heard travelers mention it before, but the distance seemed impossible now. Still, she had to try. Standing still meant certain death, so she forced one foot in front of the other, leaving small tracks in the deepening snow. By nightfall, Mary Elizabeth's situation had become desperate. The wind picked up, driving snow into her face and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Her fingers had gone numb first, then her toes. Now she could barely feel her legs as she stumbled through the drifts. She found a small, rocky outcropping that provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. Huddling against the stone, she tried to keep warm by rubbing her arms and stamping her feet, but it wasn't working. The cold was winning, and she knew it. The first night was the longest of her life. She dozed fitfully, jerking awake every few minutes when her body temperature dropped too low. When dawn finally came, she was relieved to see that she was still alive, but she could tell she was getting weaker. The second day brought more snow and even colder temperatures. Mary Elizabeth's lips had turned blue, and her speech was becoming slurred. She kept walking because movement was the only thing that generated any warmth, but her steps were getting shorter and more unsteady. That evening she found another sheltered spot beneath a large boulder. She had stopped shivering, which she dimly remembered was a bad sign. Her thoughts were becoming fuzzy, and she found herself thinking about strange things, like the warm kitchen in her childhood home, or the way her mother used to make hot soup on cold days. By the third morning, Mary Elizabeth could barely stand. Her body was shutting down, preparing for the end. She managed to crawl a few hundred yards before collapsing in the snow. The world around her seemed to be getting dimmer. Even though the sun was shining dots, she lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness when she heard something that didn't belong in the wilderness silence. It was soft and rhythmic, the sound of hoofbeats in snow. At first, she thought she might be dreaming, but the sound grew closer and more distinct. Through her blurred vision, she saw a horse and rider approaching. The man on horseback was clearly Native American, with long black hair and traditional clothing that looked much warmer than anything she was wearing. For a moment, fear cut through her hypothermia-dulled mind. Would this stranger help her, or would he see her as an enemy? The rider dismounted and knelt beside her in the snow. His face was young but weathered, with kind eyes that showed immediate concern when he saw her condition. He spoke softly in a language she didn't understand, but his tone was gentle and reassuring. This was Running Wolf, a 26-year-old Cheyenne warrior who had been tracking a wounded deer for 2 days. He had lost the animal's trail in the fresh snow, but now he had found something far more important. A human being who was dying from exposure. Running Wolf had every reason to leave the white woman where she lay. His people had suffered greatly at the hands of settlers and soldiers. His own sister had died the previous winter from a disease brought by white traders. Many in his tribe would say that helping this woman was not only foolish but dangerous, but as Running Wolf looked at Mary Elizabeth's face, something stirred in his heart. She reminded him of his sister, not in appearance but in the way she looked so young and vulnerable. He couldn't save his sister, but maybe he could save this stranger, without hesitation. Running Wolf lifted Mary Elizabeth into his strong arms. She was so cold that her body felt like ice, and he knew that time was running out. He wrapped her in the thick buffalo robe that had been keeping him warm, then carefully placed her on his horse. The ride to his winter camp took 3 hours through difficult terrain. Running Wolf had to move carefully to avoid jarring his unconscious passenger, while also watching for signs of other travelers who might pose a threat. His people's winter camp was hidden in a valley that few outsiders knew about, and he intended to keep it that way as they traveled. Running Wolf found himself wondering what he was going to tell his family and friends. Bringing a white woman to their camp would cause an uproar. Some would see it as betraying their own people. Others would worry that she might be a spy, or that helping her would bring soldiers looking for revenge. But every time he looked at Mary Elizabeth's pale face, he knew he had made the right choice. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister. She had hopes and dreams and people who cared about her, just like his sister had. How could he live with himself if he let her die when he had the power to save her? The winter camp was nestled in a protected valley where the Cheyenne people had lived for generations during the coldest months. Tipis were arranged in a circle, their buffalo hide walls decorated with painted symbols that told stories of hunts and battles and spiritual visions. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the smell of roasted meat filled the air when Running Wolf rode into camp carrying an unconscious white woman. The reaction was immediate and intense. People stopped what they were doing and gathered around, talking rapidly in Cheyenne. Some voices sounded angry, others worried, and a few seemed curious about this unexpected visitor. Running Wolf's grandmother, White Moon, was the first to step forward. She was a small, elderly woman with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that had seen many seasons of joy and sorrow. She looked at Mary Elizabeth's condition and immediately understood that questions about who she was and where she came from would have to wait. White Moon directed Running Wolf to carry the woman to her own tipi, the warmest and most comfortable in the camp. As the village's primary healer, she had saved many lives over the years, and she could see that this one would require all of her skill and experience. Other women in the tribe quickly brought warm blankets, hot broth, and healing herbs. Despite their reservations about helping a white stranger, their basic human compassion overcame their fears. This woman was dying, and their culture taught them that all life was sacred. Running Wolf stood outside the tipi as his grandmother and the other women worked to save Mary Elizabeth's life. He could hear them speaking in low, urgent voices as they tried to warm her frozen body and get life-giving liquid down her throat. Several times during that first night he thought they had lost her, but somehow she kept fighting. As dawn broke over the hidden valley, Running Wolf finally heard the sound he had been hoping for, Mary Elizabeth's voice, weak but conscious, asking where she was. White Moon emerged from the tipi with a slight smile on her weathered face. The white woman would live, she announced. Though it would take time for her to fully recover, Running Wolf felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had saved a life, but he had also brought a complication into his people's carefully ordered world. The real test would come when Mary Elizabeth was strong enough to understand where she was and what her presence meant for everyone in the camp. Mary Elizabeth opened her eyes to a world completely different from anything she had ever experienced. Soft light filtered through what looked like animal skins stretched over curved wooden poles. The air was warm and filled with unfamiliar but pleasant smells: burning sage, roasted meat, and something sweet she couldn't identify. She tried to sit up but immediately felt dizzy and weak. Her body ached everywhere, and her fingers and toes tingled painfully as feeling returned to them. A gentle hand pressed her back down onto the soft pile of furs that served as her bed. An elderly Native American woman sat beside her, speaking in a language Mary Elizabeth had never heard before. The woman's voice was soothing and kind, like a grandmother comforting a sick child. Her weathered face showed genuine concern, and her dark eyes sparkled with intelligence and warmth. This was White Moon, the camp's most respected healer. She had spent 3 days and nights nursing Mary Elizabeth back from the edge of death, using techniques passed down through generations of her people. She brewed special teas from roots and herbs, kept the fire burning to maintain warmth, and monitored every breath the white woman took. Mary Elizabeth tried to speak, but her throat was raw and her voice came out as barely a whisper. Where am I?" White Moon didn't understand the English words, but she recognized the confusion and fear in the young woman's voice. She placed a warm hand on Mary Elizabeth's forehead and spoke softly in Cheyenne, then gestured around the tipi. To show that she was safe and protected over the next few hours, other women from the tribe came to check on the strange visitor. They brought steaming bowls of broth made from buffalo bones, soft moccasins to replace her ruined shoes, and warm blankets woven from buffalo wool. Despite not sharing a common language, they communicated through smiles and gentle gestures. Mary Elizabeth was amazed by their kindness. These women had every reason to distrust her or even hate her, yet they treated her with more compassion than her own community had shown. She tried to express her gratitude through nods and attempts to help with small tasks. Even though she was still too weak to do much, on her 4th day in the camp, Mary Elizabeth was finally strong enough to step outside the tipi. What she saw took her breath away. The Cheyenne winter camp was nestled in a beautiful valley surrounded by snow-capped mountains. Dozens of tipis were arranged in a large circle, their painted designs telling stories she longed to understand. Children played in the snow, their laughter echoing off the valley walls. Women worked together, preparing food and tending to various tasks while chatting companionably. Men sat in groups, repairing weapons and tools while sharing stories. It was a community that functioned with remarkable harmony and cooperation, but Mary Elizabeth also noticed the suspicious glances that followed her wherever she walked. Not everyone in the camp was happy about her presence. Some of the younger men would stop talking when she passed by, their faces showing clear distrust. She heard heated discussions in Cheyenne that she suspected were about her. Running Wolf appeared at her side as she stood watching the daily life of the camp unfold. He was the first person she had seen who could speak some English, learned during trading expeditions with white settlements. "You feeling better?" he asked, his accent thick but his words clear enough to understand. "Yes, much better," Mary Elizabeth replied. "I want to thank you for saving my life. I know I would have died out there without your help." Running Wolf studied her face carefully. "Why your people leave you in snow to die? What you do that was so bad?" The question hit Mary Elizabeth like a physical blow. She had been trying not to think about Cedar Ridge and the painful circumstances that led to her exile. Now she had to explain it to someone who came from a completely different world. "I helped some of your people," she said quietly. "A woman and a child who came to our settlement asking for food. They were starving, so I gave them some of my supplies. My community said I was putting everyone in danger." Running Wolf listened intently, occasionally nodding as he processed her words. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You help Cheyenne people, and white people punish you for this?" he asked. "Yes, they said I was a traitor to my own kind. But helping hungry people is a good thing," Running Wolf said, confusion clear in his voice. "Why this make you traitor?" Mary Elizabeth didn't have a good answer for that question. Looking back on it now, surrounded by people who had shown her nothing but kindness, the actions of her former community seemed even more cruel and senseless. As days passed, Mary Elizabeth began to learn more about Cheyenne culture and customs. The women taught her basic words in their language. Water was mop, thank you was aho, and friend was netin. She practiced these words eagerly, wanting to communicate better with the people who had saved her life. White Moon became like a grandmother to her, patiently teaching her how to prepare traditional foods and explaining the meaning behind various ceremonies and rituals. Mary Elizabeth learned that the Cheyenne people had a deep spiritual connection to the natural world, seeing all living things as interconnected and sacred. She also learned about the tribe's recent struggles. White Moon told her through Running Wolf's translation about the increasing pressure from white settlers and soldiers. Their traditional hunting grounds were being taken over by ranchers and farmers. Treaties were made and broken regularly. Many Cheyenne had been forced onto reservations where conditions were harsh and food was scarce. "My people afraid?" Running Wolf explained during one of their conversations. "Every season, more white people come. They take our land, kill our buffalo, bring sickness that kills our children. We try to live in peace, but peace getting harder to find." Mary Elizabeth felt a deep shame as she listened to these stories. She had never thought much about how westward expansion affected the native tribes. In Cedar Ridge, people talked about Indians as obstacles to progress, not as human beings with families and feelings and legitimate claims to the land. Not everyone in the camp was willing to accept Mary Elizabeth, despite her genuine efforts to fit in. Black Fox, Running Wolf's cousin, was particularly vocal in his opposition to her presence. "She brings danger to our people," he argued during council meetings. "White soldiers will come looking for her. They will use her as excuse to attack our camp." Others worried that Mary Elizabeth might be gathering information about their location and numbers to report back to the military. These were reasonable concerns, given the long history of betrayal and violence between the two peoples, but Mary Elizabeth's actions gradually won over many of the skeptics. She worked hard at whatever tasks she was given, never complaining about the difficult conditions or the unfamiliar food. When children in the camp fell ill with fever, she stayed up nights helping their mothers care for them. When an elderly man's horse went lame, she volunteered to help make a poultice from herbs White Moon had taught her about. Most importantly, she showed genuine respect for Cheyenne customs and beliefs. She participated in daily prayers, learned traditional songs, and always asked permission before touching sacred objects or entering certain areas of the camp. Wolfe watched these changes in Mary Elizabeth with growing admiration. She was adapting to their way of life better than he had dared to hope. More than that, she seemed to genuinely care about the welfare of his people. Even though she had known them for only a few weeks, their friendship deepened as winter progressed. Wolfe taught Mary Elizabeth how to track animals in the snow, how to predict weather changes by watching cloud formations, and how to move silently through the forest. These were skills that could keep her alive if she ever had to survive on her own again. In return, Mary Elizabeth shared stories about her life before coming to the camp. She told Wolfe about books she had read, places she had dreamed of visiting, and ideas she had about how different peoples might live together in peace. Her perspectives challenged some of his assumptions about white people, just as his teachings had changed her understanding of Native Americans. As spring approached, both Mary Elizabeth and Wolfe knew that decisions would have to be made about her future. She couldn't stay in the Hidden Valley forever. Eventually, the outside world would intrude on their peaceful existence, and when it did, her presence might endanger everyone she had come to care about. But for now, in the quiet moments by the fire, as White Moon told ancient stories and children played games passed down through generations, Mary Elizabeth felt something she had never experienced in Cedar Ridge. She felt like she truly belonged somewhere, accepted not for what others expected her to be, but for who she really was. The first warm breeze of spring brought with it an unwelcome visitor to the Hidden Valley. Mary Elizabeth was helping White Moon gather early medicinal plants when they heard the sound that made every person in the camp freeze with fear, the distant thunder of many horses approaching at full gallop. Wolfe appeared at their side within seconds, his face grim as he listened to the approaching riders. "Soldiers," he said quietly. "Maybe 20 of them. They found us." The camp erupted into controlled chaos as the Cheyenne people prepared for the worst. Women quickly gathered their children and moved them to the center of the camp circle. Men grabbed their weapons and took defensive positions. Everyone knew that surprise visits from cavalry units rarely ended well for Native people. Mary Elizabeth's heart pounded as she realized what this meant. After months of living peacefully in the valley, the outside world had finally caught up with them. Worse yet, she suspected that these soldiers might be looking specifically for her. The cavalry patrol rode into the camp with military precision, their blue uniforms bright against the natural colors of the valley. At their head rode Captain Morrison, a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache and cold gray eyes that missed nothing. Mary Elizabeth recognized him immediately. He had been one of the men who had asked for her hand in marriage back in Cedar Ridge. Captain Morrison's expression showed genuine shock when he spotted Mary Elizabeth among the Cheyenne women. He had expected to find evidence of raids or stolen livestock. Instead, he found the woman whose disappearance had been the talk of every settlement from Colorado Springs to Fort Morgan. "Miss Mary Elizabeth," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the silent camp. "Step forward, please. We've come to take you home." Mary Elizabeth felt every eye in the camp turn toward her. The Cheyenne people watched nervously, unsure what would happen next. The soldiers sat rigid in their saddles, hands resting on their weapons. The tension in the air was so thick you could almost touch it. "I am home," Mary Elizabeth replied, her voice steadier than she felt inside. Captain Morrison dismounted and walked closer, his boots crunching on the scattered snow. "Miss, you've been missing for over 3 months. Your family back east has been worried sick. The whole territory has been searching for you." "I wasn't missing," Mary Elizabeth said firmly. "I was cast out by my own people and left to die." These good folks saved my life when my own community wouldn't lift a finger to help me. The captain's face hardened as he processed her words. He had heard rumors about what happened in Cedar Ridge, but he had assumed they were exaggerated. Looking at Mary Elizabeth now, dressed in Cheyenne clothing, speaking with confidence about her situation, he began to understand that the stories might have been true. "Regardless of what happened before," Captain Morrison said, "you're a white woman and you belong with white people. I'm authorized to escort you safely to Denver, where you can start a new life." Running Wolf stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Mary Elizabeth. His hand rested casually on his knife, though he made no threatening gestures. "She's free to choose where she wants to live," he said in careful English. "You don't get a say in this, boy," Captain Morrison snapped. His voice filled with the casual arrogance that Mary Elizabeth remembered from their previous encounters. "This is between civilized people." The insult hit its mark, and Mary Elizabeth saw Running Wolf's jaw tighten with controlled anger. Around the camp, other Cheyenne men shifted restlessly, their own hands moving toward their weapons. The situation was escalating quickly toward violence. "Captain Morrison," Mary Elizabeth said loudly, drawing attention back to herself, "Running Wolf has more honor and decency in his little finger than most of the civilized men I've known. He saved my life when people like you would have left me to freeze." The captain's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "Miss, you've clearly been through a terrible ordeal, and it's affected your judgment. These people have filled your head with ideas that aren't natural for a proper Christian woman." "These people," Mary Elizabeth said, her voice rising with indignation, "have shown me more Christian charity than my own community ever did. They took in a stranger who had nothing to offer them and nursed her back to health. They've treated me with kindness and respect, asking nothing in return." "Captain." Morrison looked around the camp with obvious distaste. "This isn't a proper life for a woman of your background and education. Look around you, living in animal skins, eating God knows what, surrounded by heathens who could turn on you at any moment." "I've been here for months," Mary Elizabeth replied. "Not one person has shown me anything but kindness." "Can you say the same about the people in Cedar Ridge?" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Standing Bear, Running Wolf's father and the leader of this band of Cheyenne. He was a dignified man in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. He spoke briefly with Running Wolf in Cheyenne, then turned to address Captain Morrison. "I speak for my people," Chief Standing Bear said in heavily accented but clear English. "White woman came to us dying. We saved her life because it was right thing to do. She has become part of our family. If she wants to leave, she can leave. If she wants to stay, she can stay. This is her choice to make." Captain Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Chief, I respect your hospitality toward Miss Mary Elizabeth, but I have orders to bring her back to civilization. She's not thinking clearly after her ordeal." "My thinking is perfectly clear," Mary Elizabeth interjected. "Clearer than it's been in years, actually. I've found something here that I never had in the white settlements, a sense of belonging and purpose." "You belong with your own kind," Captain Morrison insisted. "These people will never truly accept you. You'll always be an outsider, no matter how long you stay with them." White Moon, who had been quietly listening to the entire exchange, stepped forward and spoke rapidly in Cheyenne. Chief Standing Bear nodded and translated her words. "My mother says the white woman has Cheyenne heart. She says color of skin does not matter. What matters is what person does with their life. White woman has proven herself to be worthy of our trust and respect." Captain Morrison was clearly frustrated by the turn the conversation had taken. He had expected to ride into the camp, collect Mary Elizabeth, and leave within the hour. Instead, he found himself in the middle of a complex situation that challenged everything he believed about the proper order of society. "Miss Mary Elizabeth," he said, trying a different approach, "think about your future. What kind of life can you have here? You'll never be able to return to civilized society. You'll never have a proper marriage or children who can hold their heads up in decent company. Mary Elizabeth felt the weight of his words. She had been so focused on her day-to-day life in the camp that she hadn't thought much about long-term consequences. What would happen if she stayed? Could she really build a meaningful life in a world so different from the one she had grown up in? She looked around at the faces surrounding her. White Moon's eyes were filled with grandmotherly concern. Chief. Standing Bear watched with the patience of someone who had made many difficult decisions in his life. Running Wolf's expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "I need time to think," Mary Elizabeth said finally. "This is the most important decision I'll ever make, and I can't rush into it." Captain Morrison checked his pocket watch impatiently. "I can give you until tomorrow morning. But understand this, if you choose to stay here, there's no going back. The territorial government considers this area to be in a state of unofficial war. Any white person found living with hostiles will be considered a collaborator." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Mary Elizabeth understood what he was really saying. If she stayed with the Cheyenne, she would be marked as an enemy of her own people. There would be no middle ground, no possibility of moving between both worlds. That evening, as the soldiers made camp a respectful distance from the Cheyenne village, Mary Elizabeth walked alone to a hill overlooking the valley. The spring air was cool and fresh, filled with the sounds of returning birds and flowing water from melting snow. Running Wolf found her there as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long time, both understanding that everything was about to change. "What will happen to your people if I stay?" Mary Elizabeth asked finally. "I don't know," Running Wolf answered honestly. "Maybe soldiers will leave us alone. Maybe they will use you as excuse to cause trouble. My father thinks we should move deeper into mountains, find new place to live. And what do you think I should do?" Running Wolf was quiet for a long moment. "I think you must follow your heart," he said. "But I also think you must be ready to live with consequences of your choice. Whatever you decide, some people will say you are wrong." Mary Elizabeth nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. As darkness fell over the valley, she knew that by morning she would have to choose between two completely different lives, and there would be no going back from whatever decision she made. Mary Elizabeth barely slept that night. She tossed and turned on her bed of furs, her mind racing between two impossible futures. Outside the tipi, she could hear the normal sounds of the camp, the crackling of fires, quiet conversations, and the occasional whinny of horses. But everything felt different now, charged with the tension of what tomorrow would bring. Just before dawn, she gave up trying to sleep and stepped outside. The valley was beautiful in the early morning light, with mist rising from the stream that ran through the center of the camp. Birds were singing their spring songs, and the air smelled fresh and clean. It was the kind of morning that usually filled her with peace and gratitude, but today it only made her decision harder. White Moon was already awake, tending to the fire outside her tipi. The old woman looked up when Mary Elizabeth approached, and patted the ground beside her, inviting her to sit. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains. "Grandmother," Mary Elizabeth said, using the Cheyenne word White Moon had taught her, "what should I do?" White Moon studied her with those wise old eyes that had seen so much joy and sorrow over the years. She spoke softly in Cheyenne then, took Mary Elizabeth's hands in her weathered ones. Even without understanding the words, Mary Elizabeth could feel the love and acceptance in the old woman's touch. Running Wolf appeared as if summoned by their conversation. He looked tired, and Mary Elizabeth suspected he hadn't slept much either. He sat down across from them and translated his grandmother's words. "She says that heart already knows the answer. She says fear makes us doubt what we know is true, but courage means following heart even when path is difficult." By mid-morning, people from both camps, Cheyenne and cavalry, had gathered in the open space between them. Captain Morrison stood with his soldiers, their uniforms crisp and their weapons ready. Chief Standing Bear and the tribal council faced them, dignified and calm despite the tension in the air. Mary Elizabeth walked slowly into the space between the two groups. She had changed back into her simple Cheyenne dress the one white moon had made for her during the long winter months. Her hair was braided in the traditional style the women had taught her. She looked like she belonged with the Cheyenne people, and everyone present could see it. Captain Morrison stepped forward, clearly expecting her to walk toward him and the promise of returning to white civilization. Instead, Mary Elizabeth stopped in the middle of the space and turned to address both groups. 3 months ago, I was dying in the snow, she began, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. My own people had cast me out for showing kindness to strangers. I was prepared to die alone and forgotten. But someone chose to save me, even though he had every reason to let me die. She looked directly at Running Wolf as she spoke. A person could have left me where I lay. His people had suffered at the hands of white settlers and soldiers. They had no reason to trust me or help me. But they did help me, not because they had to, but because it was the right thing to do. Captain. Morrison's face was growing red with frustration. Miss Mary Elizabeth, you're talking about an isolated act of kindness, not a way of life. These people live in primitive conditions. They have no education, no proper society, no future worth speaking of. Captain Morrison, Mary Elizabeth replied. Firmly, these people have something that many of our settlements lack. They understand what it means to be truly civilized. They judge people by their actions, not by the color of their skin or the size of their bank account. They take care of their elderly and their children. They share what they have with those who need it. She turned to face the Cheyenne people. Directly, over these past months, you have shown me more acceptance and love than I ever found in my old life. You didn't ask me to change who I was. You simply gave me the chance to become the person I was meant to be. Chief Standing Bear stepped forward and spoke in Cheyenne. Running Wolf translated his father's words. My father says that if you choose to stay with us, you will face many hardships. White soldiers will always see you as traitor. Some of our own people will always see you as outsider. The path you choose will not be easy one. I understand that, Mary Elizabeth replied. But I've learned that an easy path isn't always the right path. Sometimes we have to choose between what's comfortable and what's true. Captain Morrison made one last attempt to change her mind. Think about what you're giving up. You could have a proper home in Denver with electricity and running water. You could find a suitable husband and raise children who would have every advantage that civilization can offer. Mary Elizabeth smiled sadly. Captain, I've found something here that's worth more than all the advantages you're talking about. I've found a place where I can be useful, where my life has meaning beyond just surviving from day to day. She paused, gathering her courage for what she had to say next. I'm staying with the Cheyenne people. This is my choice, made freely and with full understanding of the consequences. The reaction was immediate and intense. The soldiers muttered among themselves, clearly shocked by her decision. Some of the Cheyenne people smiled and nodded in approval, while others looked worried about what her choice would mean for their future safety. Captain Morrison shook his head in disgust. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, miss. Mark my words, you'll regret this decision before the year is out. Maybe I will, Mary Elizabeth replied calmly. But it will be my mistake to make and my regret to live with. That's more freedom than I ever had in your civilized world. White Moon stepped forward and spoke in Cheyenne to the assembled tribal council. Chief Standing Bear nodded solemnly and then addressed Mary Elizabeth in English. If you choose to be Cheyenne, then you must be Cheyenne in all ways. You must accept our customs, our beliefs, our way of life. You must be ready to fight for our people and die for our people if necessary. Are you prepared for this? I am, Mary Elizabeth answered without hesitation. White Moon approached her with a beautiful beaded dress that she had been working on secretly for weeks. As she helped Mary Elizabeth change clothes, she spoke softly in Cheyenne. Running Wolf translated the ceremony that was taking place. My grandmother is giving you a new name, he said, his voice filled with emotion. She calls you Woman Who Walks Between Worlds. She says you will help our people understand white ways and maybe help white people understand our ways. The formal adoption ceremony was brief but meaningful. Mary Elizabeth knelt before the tribal council as Chief Standing Bear spoke the traditional words that welcomed her into the Cheyenne Nation. When she stood up, she was no longer Mary Elizabeth, the outcast from Cedar Ridge. She was woman who walks between worlds. A member of the Cheyenne people. Captain Morrison and his soldiers left the valley without another word, their faces grim with disapproval. Mary Elizabeth watched them go and felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She was burning bridges that could never be rebuilt, but she was also stepping into a future that felt right in her heart. As summer arrived, Mary Elizabeth settled fully into her new life. She and Running Wolf were married in a traditional Cheyenne ceremony that lasted 3 days and involved the entire community. White Moon taught her the ancient songs and stories that passed down tribal wisdom from generation to generation. But her new life wasn't without challenges. Government officials in Denver marked her as a renegade, and bounty hunters sometimes came looking for the white woman living with savages. The tribe had to move their camps several times to avoid military patrols that were becoming more aggressive. Mary Elizabeth used her knowledge of white customs and language to help her adopted people navigate the complicated politics of territorial expansion. She wrote letters to government officials, trying to negotiate fair treatment for the Cheyenne. She helped translate during meetings with Indian agents, making sure that her people understood exactly what was being asked of them. Years passed, and Mary Elizabeth's children grew up speaking both English and Cheyenne, comfortable in both worlds. Even as those worlds continued to clash around them, she taught them to read and write, while Running Wolf taught them to hunt and track and live off the land. When historians later wrote about the settlement of the American West, they rarely mentioned people like Mary Elizabeth. Her story didn't fit the neat narratives about civilization versus savagery that dominated the history books. But among the Cheyenne people, her story lived on. Children grew up hearing about the white woman who chose love over safety, who picked the longing over comfort, who proved that the things that divide us are often less important than the things that unite us. They learned that sometimes the greatest courage isn't found in fighting enemies, but in opening your heart to people who are different from yourself. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the camp settled in for the night, Mary Elizabeth would sit with White Moon and watch the stars come out over the mountains. She would think about the cold February morning when she was cast out to die, and marvel at how that terrible day had led to the most beautiful life she could have imagined. She had found her home not in a place but in the hearts of people who saw her true worth. And in choosing to stay with them, she discovered